Well, hello everybody. This is Sanchez and I would like to welcome you to our first flipped video lecture. Today's video lecture we have two goals in mind. Number one, we're going to get you used to this flipped lecture format. And number two, we want to go ahead and briefly review what we've discussed on democracy and start looking ahead to our next piece, which is going to talk about something known as democratic ideals, and introducing our first document of democracy, a document known as Magna Carta. Now today for the flipped lecture, we're going to go ahead and practice taking notes in a format which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The format is called Cornell Notes, and you can see on the front screen, this is how I'd like you to set up your history logbook. I'd like you to go ahead right now, and I want you to go ahead and set up a left-hand column. And that left-hand column is going to be exclusively for main bold titles. And when you go back to revisit your notes, we can also add questions and annotations. On the right-hand side, which is going to be a larger section, that's going to be your main note-taking column. So pretty much all the bullets and additional information when I'm explaining and going through the lecture will be on the right-hand portion. And then finally, at the very end of the flip video lecture for today, we're going to go ahead and ask you to write a brief summary. The summary is usually about 3 to 5 sentences, just making sure that you can properly explain what we've discussed in a video lecture. So to give you a sense on the front screen, you can see that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 main headings. Now don't write them in just yet, but I'm going to go ahead and show you in the sense those are the main topics we'll be hitting in today's video lecture. And again, those will go in the left-hand column, and then you can also see on the screen the bulk of the notes will go on the right-hand column. Alright, so first and foremost, we spend a great deal of time right now talking about democracy. Democracy in the simplest sense translates to rule of the people, power to the people. We've talked about how direct democracy begins in ancient Greece and is a system where every citizen voted directly. We also introduced the concept that part of the Greeks' contributions to democracy is something called Greek philosophy. So those names that we've annotated in class, they're quotes and words of wisdom, which include Aristotle, which include Plato, Socrates. These men are trying to use critical thinking, try to use their brains using logic and reason to really ask questions about rights, liberties, freedom, and of course who should have the power, who should be in charge, and what truly is a democratic form of government. We also took a look at the Roman Republic. Now the Romans are going to continue using a democratic form of government. However, we refer to the Roman form of democracy as a republic. A republic, the definition, is a representative form of government, but in this case we don't have the citizens voting directly, we have the citizens voting for the people. And those people will make laws and make decisions on behalf of those citizens. So again, remember, we have a republic. We elect senators and congressmen and congresswomen, and they go to Washington and they represent our voice, and they work with our government and our president to make laws for our countries. Another trick to remember, every day when you say the Pledge of Allegiance, if you notice or not, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. So the United States of America is a uses a Roman Republican form of government. Now, part of a democracy to be successful, the way that we have citizens to participate and use their power is to have voting. So voting over the past week or so we've been talking about, the real question is, voting, is it a right? Is something you have the privilege to go out and cast your ballot and speak your piece and get your voice heard? Or is it a responsibility? Is it something that every citizen should be required to do? The question we just answered yesterday in class is, should the United States of America develop a compulsory voting system? Remember, compulsory voting means it should be mandatory. There should be no other option but to have citizens go and cast their ballots. And if they don't, there's going to be consequences and penalties. And that's really to ensure, in some people's perspectives, to make sure we have all voices and making sure that every citizen feels like they're getting their voice heard and they're part of our democratic process. All right, before we move on, let's go ahead and hit the pause button for a moment. And what I would like you to do right now is go ahead and turn to your table mates, and I want you to go ahead and briefly share what notes you've taken down based on just the first 3 slides. Now I know you of course have copied the bullet points, but talk with your table mates and see if there's any additional information from what I've explained or what you remember from our previous discussions that you can write down for our first 3 slides. All right, turn to your table mates. All right, after going over where we've been with democracy, I also want to take some time to introduce a discussion of what we call citizens' rights. So if voting is a right or responsibility, of course, we're talking about with your essays, but we're also going to be looking at citizens' rights, and we call them known as democratic ideals. So there's 5 of them that we're going to introduce today. We're going to talk about all next week, and we're going to see how in a democratic society, what does it look like ideally to protect citizens' rights, and what are some documents that have been created in history and still exist today that are trying to make sure that citizens' rights are protected. So the first one, the number 1 I put at the top of the screen, is something called rule of law. When we talk about rule of law, we're basically talking about the idea that nobody is above the law. It doesn't matter if you're a king, or if you're wearing a crown, or if you're rich, or if you're poor, if you have power. Bottom line, the law of the land is applied equally and applied to all citizens. Now, that may sound like a simple concept, folks, but actually it's pretty complex. And there's several places in the world today that don't have that principle. So in a true democracy, a rule of law is extremely important. The second one I would like you to write down is something known as limited government. In the case of the question, should Americans be forced to vote? A lot of you wrote in your essays that no, we shouldn't be forced to vote because that's the government telling us what to do, or taking too much power, or taking away our freedom. So in a true democratic form of government, the government's not too powerful, and it's in a limited form. All right, and then the last 3 on our list we're going to be exploring is this concept called consent of the governed. If you're giving consent, you're giving permission. So in a true democracy, for it to work and run properly is the whole concept that the people are willing to consent and obey and follow the law and to vote to ensure that the government, again, is working for them, for making laws, making sure they're protected. So it's really kind of a partnership. It's kind of an invisible contract that the government and the people have. Number 4 I would like you to write down is the concept of individual liberty. The concept of liberty, you can AKA it or T for it, is freedom. That every single citizen in a democratic form of government has the right for freedom, and that government should protect that right to freedom. So for example, when we start talking about the Bill of Rights in America, some of our individual liberties and freedoms that are protected, some of our First Amendment rights that you might be familiar with. So example, the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, the freedom of petition, the freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. So we take for granted in America with a democratic form of government that individual liberty is something that is truly valued and protected with our laws. And then finally, number 5 we'd like you to write down is something called due process. Now, due process is especially important when we're talking about relating to the law. Due process, we're talking about that if you're accused of something, you have the right for justice. You have the right to have a fair trial, and the law is applied equally and fair. If you actually have to violate a law to actually be thrown in front of a judge or actually thrown in jail. And also you have this concept of you have the right to have a trial by jury. That's not always the case in some particular situations. So a true democracy, democratic ideals, citizens' rights involve due process. All right, let's go ahead and hit the pause button again, folks. I want you to go ahead and turn back to your table mates, and you should have wrote down 5 of our democratic ideals, or 5 citizens' rights we're going to be looking at next week. So go ahead and just briefly discuss some of the key words and key ideas you annotated or wrote next to our 5 ideals. Take a moment. Go. All right, and then finally for today, I want to go ahead and introduce one of our major documents that really embodies our 5 democratic ideals is a document known as the Magna Carta. Now, the idea of democracy developed gradually, as you studied before, in Greece and in Rome, and they spread the ideas of responsibility and individual worth and citizens' rights. And finally, we see democracy is finally going to take root and finally found a permanent home in England right around the Middle Ages. You can see on the screen, I would like you to write down the year 1215. Now, in England at the time, we have a king by the name of King John. Now, King John goes down in history, folks, as one of the worst kings of all time. He's the type of king that is trying to collect heavy taxes, he's trying to take a lot of his people's money, and he's trying to pay for a lot of expensive wars with France and other countries. Not only that, but if the barons and the lords and the nobles didn't pay these high taxes, the king would just simply throw them in jail or find some horrible punishment. So we see in England, the barons and the lords, they get to the point where enough's enough, and they decide to tell King John, look, we need to have a voice. We need to have a say in what goes on in our country and working with the government. So in a series of negotiations, we see that it comes to a point where this document is drawn up, known as the Great Charter, or again we know today as the Magna Carta. Now, Magna Carta just celebrated its 800th anniversary, which is pretty amazing. And even though this document sounds super old and outdated, this is the document that lays the groundwork for all our major documents. So when we say Magna Carta, we are connecting to today our U.S. Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and pretty much everything you're going to be learning about when you get to U.S. Gov. Now, what I would like you to do is we're going to go ahead and watch a brief video clip to finish up this video lecture. And as you guys are watching, I would like you to add some notes beneath your Magna Carta or next to your Magna Carta section. Now listen in particular where the video talks about the fact that the Magna Carta is going to have limited government. It's also going to instill the democratic ideal of due process. And finally, establishing the rule of law in England. So if you can kind of listen to or key in any of those ideals and jot down a few notes so we can discuss in one moment.
For 8 centuries it's been hailed as the document which gave birth to English democracy and justice. 4 copies of the Magna Carta still exist. One of the 2 in the British Library is so badly damaged it's illegible. But the royal seal of approval curtailed the monarch's power. It was written in Latin, but the English translation contains words which are still enshrined in law today.
But the most important thing about Magna Carta was that it established the principle of the rule of law. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or outlawed or exiled, except by the judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. And that clause is really at the heart of Magna Carta's fame today.
And yet this was a deal between a tyrannical king and powerful barons. It didn't apply to ordinary people.
King John had imposed heavy taxes on his barons in order to pay for his expensive foreign wars. If they refused to pay, he punished them severely or seized their property. The barons demanded that King John obey the law. When he refused, they captured London and John was forced to negotiate.
The 2 sides met at Runnymede to hammer out a peace treaty. They'd all be amazed at how their great charter is still revered today. This monument was paid for by American lawyers. After all, the Magna Carta was valid for just 10 weeks. The Pope declared that King John had signed it under duress and had it annulled. So how come a failed treaty has become such a worldwide symbol of democracy that the current monarch will be among those celebrating its 800th anniversary? The Magna Carta was revised and rewritten over the years. Its principles were adopted by America's founding fathers in their Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights. So much so